It's no fault of Elvis. He loved the song.
Everyone thinks they know Dolly Parton. The rhinestones, the wig collection bigger than most apartment stores, the voice that turns a porch song into a hymn. For more than 50 years, she's been sold to the world as country music's sweetheart. Endlessly kind, endlessly generous, never a bad word for anybody. That reputation isn't manufactured. People who work with her for decades back it up. But a 50-year career in the entertainment business doesn't happen without friction, and Dolly herself has never pretended otherwise. In interviews, in her memoirs, and offhand remarks to journalists over the decades, she has talked openly, in her own words, about lawsuits, hurt feelings, a scandal that made her threaten legal action for the first time in her life, and creative clashes with people she loved working with anyway. None of it involves her naming 5 singers she hated. That's not a real event, and it's not how Dolly talks about anybody. Even people who genuinely wronged her. What's real is more interesting than the tabloid version. A woman who came up hard, learned early that kindness and toughness aren't opposites, and has quietly out-negotiated, outlasted, and out-forgiven almost everyone who ever crossed her. Here are 5 of those real stories, where they came from, what actually happened, and how they were resolved. To understand why Dolly handles conflict the way she does, you have to go back to Locust Ridge, Tennessee, and a one-room cabin with no running water. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born there on January 19th, 1946, the 4th of 12 children. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, farmed and worked construction and never learned to read or write. Something Dolly has said didn't stop him from being one of the smartest people she ever knew. Her mother, Avi Lee, raised those 12 kids before she turned 36 and filled the house with old ballads, hymns, and Appalachian storytelling. Music wasn't a luxury in that household. It was one of the only things that was free. The Parton kids sang in church and harmonized on the porch because there wasn't money for much else. And by the time Dolly was 10, her voice had already gotten her onto local radio and television in Knoxville. She was performing at the Grand Ole Opry as a young teenager. The day after she graduated high school in 1964, she got on a bus for Nashville with no money and no connections. Just, as she's told the story many times, a plan and enough stubbornness to see it through. She spent her first couple of years writing songs for other artists before her own break came with Dumb Blonde in 1967, a song that was as much a statement of intent as it was a single. Don't mistake the look for substance. That mix, raised dirt poor, self-made from age 18, business savvy enough to eventually own her own publishing company, theme park, and production empire, is a context for every conflict on this list. Dolly doesn't fight from a place of fragility. She fights, when she has to, from a place of knowing exactly what she's worth. And usually, she doesn't fight loudly at all. She just quietly makes sure she doesn't lose. The most consequential professional relationship of Dolly's early career was also the one that eventually ended up in a courtroom filing. Porter Wagoner was already a country star by the mid-1960s with his own nationally syndicated television program, The Porter Wagoner Show. In 1967, he hired Dolly to replace his longtime female vocalist, Norma Jean, who was leaving the show. It wasn't a warm welcome. Norma Jean had a devoted fan base, and when Dolly stepped into that spot, some viewers openly resented her. Wagoner stuck with his decision anyway. And within a couple of years, the two of them have become one of the most successful duet acts in country music, racking up top 10 hits and building a screen chemistry audiences loved. Off camera, the dynamic was more complicated. Wagoner ran the show, his name was on it, and he made that clear in how decisions got made. Dolly has said in multiple interviews that their working relationship involved real power struggles. He had a say over her material, her schedule, and much of her career direction. She's also described him, in a Whiskey Riff interview looking back on those years, as having a controlling streak that made it hard for the two of them to work as equals, even as her own ambitions kept growing. By 1974, after 7 years on the show, years longer than she'd originally agreed to stay, Dolly told Wagoner she was leaving to build a solo career. She said the conversation was emotional and difficult, and that Wagoner struggled to accept it because her departure meant real changes for his own show and business. The night before she gave her notice, according to Dolly, she wrote 2 songs in one sitting. Jolene and I Will Always Love You, the second of which was, in her own words, her way of telling him what she couldn't say directly, a goodbye set to music. The next day, she played it for him in his office. He agreed to let her go on the condition that he could produce the track. On the surface, the split looked amicable. It wasn't over. 5 years later, on March 21st, 1979, Wagner filed a lawsuit against Dolly seeking roughly $3 million, alleging breach of contract, according to court filings referenced in later reporting. He wanted an accounting of her income and record royalties going back to 1974, along with 15% of what she'd earned since leaving his show, money he argued he was owed as her former manager and the man who'd built her platform. Dolly has talked about how blindsided she felt. In her memoir, Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, she wrote that she believed she could probably have won the case outright, but chose to settle instead rather than put her husband and family through a long, bitter court fight. The two sides settled out of court for close to $1 million. Money, Dolly has said, took everything she and her husband, Carl Dean, had at the time. She's since described it plainly. Wagner got the first $1 million she ever made. In the years right after the lawsuit, Wagner didn't hold back publicly either. In the book Dolly on Dolly, he's quoted describing her as living in a kind of fantasy world and questioning her loyalty, while also insisting he wasn't bitter about her success, a claim that sat awkwardly next to the fact that he just sued her. It was, by any reading, one of the ugliest chapters of Dolly's early career, made harder by the fact that it involved someone who had genuinely helped launch her. Time did what time tends to do. By the late 1980s, the two were speaking again, and in 2002, Dolly inducted Porter Wagner into the Country Music Hall of Fame herself, speaking on stage about what he'd meant to her despite everything that had happened between them. When he was hospitalized with lung cancer in 2007, she visited him. He died shortly after, and Dolly held a tribute concert at Dollywood in his memory, not a press event. Just something she did for the man who gave her her first real shot, complicated as that gift turned out to be. Not every conflict on this list is a lawsuit. Some are simpler. Three enormously talented, enormously busy people try to make art together on very different clocks. In the mid-1980s, Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris, three of the biggest women in American music, from three different corners of it, finally found the time to record together as a trio, something they'd talk about doing for years. The album, simply called Trio, came out in 1987. It went platinum, hit #1 on the country album charts, and won a Grammy. By every commercial measure, it worked. The recording sessions were a different story. Dolly has described the dynamic among the three of them in a Ladies' Home Journal interview she later gave, and repeated in several other places, as something that could have been titled The Three Tempers. She said she liked to nail a vocal quickly, sometimes on the first or second take. Harris, in Dolly's telling, was a careful, deliberate perfectionist who researched material thoroughly. And Ronstadt, according to Dolly, liked to take her time in the studio in a way that Dolly openly found maddening, at one point saying, colorfully, that it drove her nuts and that she wanted to tell Ronstadt to hurry up. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the opposite of how this conflict sometimes gets repeated online. It wasn't Ronstadt publicly complaining that Dolly was unreliable. By Dolly's own account, it was Dolly who found Ronstadt's meticulous studio process frustrating, while also acknowledging, in the same interviews, that the sound the three of them made together was something close to magical. The tension came to a head around the second album. The three of them reconvened to record Trio 2 in 1994, but the release got delayed, partly over label politics, and partly because Dolly, tied up with other business, sitcom, and book commitments, asked her partners to push the release date so she'd have time to properly promote it. That didn't sit well with everyone involved, and at one point the friction got serious enough that Dolly had her vocals pulled from some tracks, so they couldn't be released without her. The album that resulted eventually came out in 1999, 5 years after it was recorded, under the title Trio 2. The three women didn't stay estranged. Ronstadt has spoken about the experience with warmth in later interviews, even while acknowledging how hard it was to coordinate three strong-willed stars with three different working styles. It's a case less of feud and more what happens when brilliant people with very different processes try to share a microphone. Real friction, honestly discussed by the person often blamed for causing it, and ultimately outlasted by the music itself. This next one isn't a feud so much as a business decision Dolly has called one of the most painful of her career, and one that, decades later, made her a fortune. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was one of the biggest stars on the planet, known for taking other writers' songs and turning them into signature hits of his own. He wanted to do the same with I Will Always Love You, the song Dolly had written for Porter Wagoner and released as a single in 1974. According to Dolly, everything was arranged for Presley to record it. She'd even been invited to attend the session. Then, the night before the recording was set to happen, Presley's longtime manager, Colonel Tom Parker, called her directly. Dolly has recounted this story in multiple interviews, including one with BBC Radio, in almost identical detail each time. Parker told her that Presley didn't record anything unless his team held at least half the publishing rights to the song. Dolly, who by then had her own publishing company and had already had a #1 hit with the track, told him she couldn't do that. It was, in her words, the most important copyright in her whole publishing catalog, money she intended to leave to her family. Parker's response was final. If she wouldn't give up half the publishing, Presley wouldn't record it. Dolly has said more than once that turning that offer down broke her heart a little. She's spoken about how much she admired Presley, how she knew how badly he wanted to sing the song, and how she later learned, from a conversation with Priscilla Presley, that Elvis had sung I Will Always Love You to her himself unaccompanied as they walked down the courthouse steps on the day their divorce was finalized. That detail, which Dolly has shared publicly, suggests the song meant something to him personally even without ever officially recording it. There's no evidence of a lasting personal rift between Dolly and Elvis. No reported falling out. No bitterness on either side beyond the disappointment of a deal that didn't happen. What there is instead is a striking what-if. Dolly held on to full ownership of a song that Elvis Presley wanted and didn't get, and years later Whitney Houston's 1992 cover for The Bodyguard turned it into one of the best-selling singles by a female artist in history, earning Dolly, by her own account, more money than she ever imagined, precisely because she refused to give any of it away. In 2023, Dolly released a song called I Dreamed About Elvis, imagining a conversation between them that finally addresses a cover that never happened. Her way, decades later, of putting the story to rest in her own words. If there's one entry on this list that genuinely made Dolly Parton angry in public, not hurt, not disappointed, but angry, it's this one. In May 2008, staffers on the Howard Stern Show took audio from Dolly's own memoir audiobook, Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, read in her voice, and digitally re-edited fragments of it into a fake segment. The splice clip made it sound as though Dolly was making sexually explicit and racially charged remarks, along with insulting comment about other celebrities, including Kenny Rogers, Burt Reynolds, Johnny Carson, and her own former trio collaborator Linda Ronstadt. It aired on May 6, 2008, framed as comedy. Dolly did not treat it as comedy. Days later, she released a public statement that was uncharacteristically blunt for someone known for staying above the fray. I have never been so shocked, hurt, and humiliated in all my life. I cannot believe what Howard Stern has done to me. In a blue million years, I would never have such vulgar things come out of my mouth. She said the show had used editing and trickery to fabricate the material, apologized to anyone who'd been offended by words that weren't actually hers, and said plainly that if she was ever going to sue anyone, it would be over this. Stern didn't apologize at the time. He and his team characterized the bit as obvious parody, said it was clearly not real, and moved on. No lawsuit was ultimately filed, but the two of them didn't cross paths again for 15 years. That changed in 2023 when Dolly appeared on Stern's show for the first time ever, promoting her rock album, Rockstar. By most accounts of the appearance, Stern was notably respectful. He called her a legend, praised her voice and her energy, and didn't attempt the kind of shock jock routine the 2008 incident had involved. Whether that shift reflected genuine reconsideration on his part or simply professional courtesy toward a guest promoting a major release is something only the two of them really know. What's clear is that Dolly showed up, did the interview, and didn't bring up 2008 to score points. Consistent with a pattern she's shown across every conflict on this list. Say how you feel once, clearly, and then let time do the rest of the work. The last entry here isn't a feud at all. It's a piece of pointed, very public criticism from a fellow musician, and it's worth including because of how directly it challenges Dolly's legacy as a songwriter, even from someone who insists he admires her. In January 2024, Wilco frontman Jeff Tweedy appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert to promote his book, World Within a Song, which discusses music that shaped his life, including songs he doesn't actually like. Pressed by Colbert about which beloved songs made his list, Tweedy admitted that I Will Always Love You was one of them. When Colbert pushed back, jokingly summarizing Tweedy's position as, Dolly Parton has no talent, Tweedy immediately corrected him. He loves Dolly Parton, he said, but he pointed out that she wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You back-to-back, in the same short stretch of songwriting, and joked that he wished she'd stopped after Jolene. Pushed on why, Tweedy was refreshingly specific rather than sweeping. His real issue was with the song's famous held note on the word I in the chorus, which he connected his own inability to hold a long note himself. I know it's me. I know I'm wrong, he said on air, framing it explicitly as a personal quirk rather than a serious critique of Dolly's songwriting. Dolly has addressed the Jolene / I Will Always Love You same-day songwriting story before. In a 2022 conversation on the audio platform Clubhouse, she said she wasn't entirely sure the two songs were written on the exact same night, only that they turned up on the same old cassette tape and ended up on the same 1974 album, Jolene, written within a short span of each other. There's no public record of Dolly responding directly to Tweedy's Colbert appearance, given the self-deprecating, half-joking nature of his comments, and given that two of Dolly's most enduring, most covered songs are the exact ones under discussion. It reads far more like an offbeat aside from a fellow songwriter than anything resembling a rivalry. None of these 5 stories involve Dolly Parton naming enemies or settling scores on camera. What they show instead is something more consistent with everything else we know about her, a woman who came from nothing, learned early to protect what was hers, and has spent 50 years handling betrayal, business disputes, public humiliation, and creative friction the same way, directly, honestly, without theatrics, and usually followed years later by some form of grace. She sued no one first. She